Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on what time you are viewing this podcast. This podcast series we call Race, Culture, and the Church. Race, Culture, and the Church. This series we started 1 week after the murder of George Floyd. So I invite you to go back and to look at, scroll through the folks that we have had into this space, the conversations that we have had. Again, 1 week after the murder of George Floyd, we started this and we started this discussion. So race, culture, and the church are the three target areas that we intend to delve into. Hopefully we'll hit all three today, but I am pleased, I am honored, I am absolutely honored to have into this space the person of Mr. Carson Anderson. He is the past director of historic preservation for the city of Sacramento. Welcome, Carson.
Thank you so much for having me. It's my pleasure to be here.
You are I had the benefit of spending time with you at lunch. We talked. I just knew, and when we were having lunch and speaking, I said, "Oh no, I need to have Mr. Anderson into this space and talk about race, culture, and the church." I guarantee we will hit all three topic areas. But before we get into the whole project, the African American experience that you're helping lead for the city of Sacramento and for our African American community, wanted to get to know, have the audience have the benefit of knowing who Carson Anderson is. How did you? Where'd you come from, and how did you end up here in Sacramento, of all places in these 50 states?
I grew up in Los Angeles, and I did a number of projects for the city, including the redevelopment agency in LA, that revolved around documenting ethnic historical resources. And so that's where this interest in the current project began, like a few decades ago. In Pasadena, I did the Ethnic Historical Architectural Resources Survey for the city that documented some 8 or 10 different ethnic groups and where they were located in the city, and the buildings and the sites that were associated with them, including the African American community and the Armenian community and a Mexican American community there, and several others. So that really did plant a seed for doing this kind of research work. And then I came to Sacramento to take the position of Director of Historic Preservation back in 2016. And so that's where my connection with Sacramento grew, as I learned more about the history and the culture and the people of this particular place.
There had to have been a spark of interest. Something had to, the match that lit the flame that got you going in LA and Pasadena. Was that something young Carson Anderson always had a inclination, a love of people, a love of history?
Interesting. So I began my college career as an international studies major at Pomona College, and one of my faculty advisors handed me a copy of a book by Jane Jacobs called The Death and Life of Great American Cities, and she talked about why urban renewal, which has been so adverse to communities of color in the 20th century. Basically, it was federal funding that funded the demolition of whole neighborhoods and the building of highways and other public improvements, usually in neighborhoods lower income or minority, quote, minority or persons of color neighborhoods. Just saying that was all wrong. That was like using a bazooka to kill a fly. That there were organic processes that cities went through of renewal and decay, and the smaller scale things that people were doing to revitalize neighborhoods, preserve historic resources. The sense of place was really the way to go. And that just sort of lit a light bulb in my brain, and I changed my major subsequently and turned it more to a focus on planning of cities, urban design, how do we incorporate historic preservation, and the stories, the rich histories that people have in their own lived experiences, how we can pull that into the revitalization of cities in a way that is organic, meaningful to people, that preserves the history. So I would say that's kind of where that started. And then graduate school kind of deepened that, where I focused on studying historic preservation practice and architectural history.
Mr. Anderson, I'm going down that rabbit hole now. So, in your studies, in your research, in your worldview, have you seen historic preservation? Have you seen the evolution of city in this country done well? If so, where?
So I mentioned urban renewal, these blanket decisions to demolish whole neighborhoods back in the 1940s and 50s and early 1960s.
And that was much to do with the interstate highway program.
In part, yes, but it was also this overblown notion about slums, quote unquote. And we had lending programs of the federal government that focused on things like, is this neighborhood one where persons of color lived? And if it was indeed an integrated neighborhood or a majority persons of color neighborhood, then it got a lower credit rating, which meant that it was harder for the people in those communities to get loans to repair their buildings or to build new buildings to revitalize the neighborhood. So it basically reinforced the processes of deterioration. I would say some of our cities, like, for example, San Francisco commissioned a study sort of like the one that we're doing here in Sacramento about 5 or 6 years ago. And they released their African American historic context, I'd say in about 2015 or 2016, after they worked on it a little bit more and revised it. But they have things like cultural districts where they highlight not just the buildings. That's been one of the faults of preservation in the past, too focused on pretty buildings, buildings that have major design significance. What the shift is, and San Francisco sort of embodies that, is looking at the history that's behind neighborhood and place, and lifting up place and the cultural and the historical associations with place that make it significant for people. So yes, they're looking at the beautiful architecture and documenting it and putting things on the landmark register in San Francisco, but they're also embracing the idea of the people's history, the cultural and historical factors and the stories that really give places their power for people.
Well, again, I don't want to go down the rabbit hole of San Francisco per se, but I'm thinking of Hunters Point.
Yes.
And, so let me see if I can ask my question a different way. Change is inevitable.
Yes.
Change, just period, full
That's
stop.
right.
Change is inevitable. So given that, how does a community not have, is it always inevitable to have, say, the transformation that took place in West Oakland over the course of 20 years? I happened to be working in that area, general area, during that time, and I saw with my own eyes how a community changed. Have you seen good, I won't even say great, but just good urban renewal that considers the people that are there as well as the inevitable architectural progression that will take place? Is there a city you can point to and it's like, well, look at Savannah, and I'm just making that up.
Sure.
They got it 60% right.
It's a work in progress. The city planning, the housing development sectors of government our scholars at the universities have all been studying the issue of gentrification. That's, I think, what you're talking about, the process you're describing in West Oakland and elsewhere. It's occurring here at Oak Park. I think there's lots of evidence of that. When you look at the commercial corridors in Oak Park, you see that there's obviously a shift going on in the economics and the demographics of Oak Park. I would say I see little bits and pieces of successes all around. I'll point to San Francisco again and looking at Mission Street, which has been a majority Latin American, predominantly Mexican American neighborhood in San Francisco for some decades now, and an effort to preserve legacy businesses, legacy Latino-owned businesses. So there's a registry that they have set up so that the city can kind of devote resources to protecting those businesses so they endure, helping them market and find the clientele base that they need to continue thriving. Efforts to limit the square footage of ground floor retail along Mission Street. There was this phenomenon of wealthier non-Latino individuals going in and putting in restaurants and kind of clearing out the first floor area and two adjoining buildings and combining them. It was sort of the beginning of this transformation of space, the changing of real estate values and rents in the neighborhood. And so the city came up with a zoning restrictions to kind of govern how much square footage so that the historic patterns of smaller shop footprints could be preserved. And so there's a better chance of keeping the legacy businesses there and allowing smaller kind of startup businesses to keep, have the feet under them to launch their businesses. So those are the ones that are closest at hand, I would say, but there are obviously other examples around the country. And doing what the city of Sacramento is doing in documenting, doing a historic context statement, which is kind of a fancy buzzword for doing an overview history that talks about the history of the Black community here, organized by various historical themes, like how did people arrive here? Where did they come from? Where did they live? What kind of businesses did people establish over time? What were the civic institutions, like the churches and the clubs and the other organizations that the community created? What were the contributions to the arts and recreation in that field made by African Americans? And of course, not to be left out the whole issue of how people struggled for their civil rights. How did Black Sacramentans push against the walls of segregation and racism to achieve dignity and affirm their values, human beings, and claim the rights that are owed them as human beings. All of those are kind of the themes in the historic context that Sacramento is now preparing a second draft of. And so that illuminates some of these topics that a city can come along later and they can say, this is an area where there's a lot of historical layers of historical associations that needs to be preserved in some way. And then zoning regulations and other policies can be crafted that kind of try to protect those resources in a, what's the word I want? Not an 11th hour kind of way, which is usually what happens with preservation. It takes so much time to document what's there that things are not documented, and then a developer wants to knock a building down, and then because of the environmental review process, then we find out in the 11th hour that it's something important, but the developers invested tens of thousands of dollars in going forward with a project. And so by doing the studies that the city is doing right now, we now some foresight in the planning so that we can kind of steer development away from sites that are very, very important historical that need to be preserved and protected and lifted up. So that's one of the purposes of what I'm
So
doing.
it's I could spend the rest of our time just on that, because what I'm hearing is you need the documentation in order to save us from ourselves.
Yes.
That you can't. I guess my eyes and what I see and observe aren't sufficient. I need a record to say, yeah, your eyes are correct, as opposed to seeing a community that when my parents moved from Bakersfield, Oak Park was one of the only places they could move, and so I lived here for the better part of 3 years at one point. Went to Bret Hart Elementary, lived on 33rd Street, so I know Oak Park. And I like to say, God's got jokes. He's brought us back to Oak Park. This, for several generations, this has been a predominantly African American community that is, again, change is inevitable, and the change is taking place. But again, I'll double down on my question, and I won't belabor the point. I'm not hearing any city that has taken a proactive move. Documenting's good, but a proactive move is like, no, we're not going to just wholesale displace a community just because money is the mover, if you will. We're Again, I'm trying to look back, trying to go forward, looking in the rearview mirror. Is there a place? Is there a city that has proactively looked to preserve the legacy of a community and at the same time allow the wheels of progress to keep turning? Let me go out on a limb. I think the short answer is no, because I keep asking the question, not only to yourself, but I've asked it to others. And as I asked even to Councilmember Jay Chenier, when it came to gentrification, I said, have you seen it done well anywhere? His answer was no. He said, but we could be the first. I said, okay, I accept that. But his short answer was no. So again, well, let's document it. So let me just put a comma there, maybe not a period, because how we met, just had the good fortune of meeting you. It was around the African American experience, the historic experience that the city of Sacramento is, to their credit, to your credit, has taken this on as an issue. Just kind of summarize, what is that? What is it you are attempting to do? What is it the city is attempting to do?
There is a lot of ignorance about the history of African Americans in California, in Sacramento, in our nation as a whole. And that ignorance about the rich cultural legacy that Black people have brought, despite the oppression, the discrimination, the segregation, the denial of opportunity, is something that I think can reshape people's perceptions of Blackness. We too took note of the Stephon Clark and the George Floyd murders by police, and we took note of the efforts in other jurisdictions around the country to whitewash Black history, to scrub out the inconvenient and uncomfortable truths, such as the existence of slavery and why that existed, and the prevalence of mob violence and segregation and discrimination. So it seemed important to us to deal with this history and put it out there. Hopefully it will reach beyond the Black community here, and others will pick up the context statement and embrace it and look at it and learn from it. So that was perhaps the foremost motivation. Then we were lucky enough to apply for a grant from the National Trust for Historic Preservation. They have an African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund. It's quite a mouthful. Say that 5 times faster.
I can't say it once. Slowly.
So they are the funders of this probably $250,000 project that we're doing, but they gave us a grant of $50,000. So the city, and it's a team, I don't want to claim full responsibility for this effort. I'm very committed and passionate about it, but our current preservation director, Sean DeCourcy, and Lynette Hall, who is our public engagement officer and a native of Oak Park, she and her family and others are supporting this effort in an equally committed way to make sure it's successful. So that was sort of the motivator for why we thought this was important. And then I touched upon it in our prior discussion that preservation is often kind of an 11th hour process where we spend so much time researching things, but where there's never enough time to find everything. And so development is proposed for a particular property, and then we find out that it has historic significance that should be recognized in some way, but we fight a battle, sometimes at city council level, to try and persuade our elected officials that maybe we should save this building and not allow it to be demolished. And the desire for economic development and reinvestment sometimes trumps efforts to save things. So
where are you today? We're recording this in mid-April. Where are you in the arc of the development of this document?
And I should say, and I haven't stressed this point before, that it is the historic context statement, and we're producing a second draft of that now. The first draft of it went out, hit the streets in, I'm going to say mid-November of last year, and we've had a number of community meetings. I think we've had 8 so far to allow people to pick up, hold the document, learn what it is, what it has, to kind of look at the part of the document that they most connect with and give us comments on it, look through their photo albums, provide photographs that we can scan and then give back to them, and then we can incorporate that in the report. The second draft will come out probably mid-May. That'll be a beefed up version. We had the first draft was something like 150 pages. So this next draft will probably be, an additional 50 to 100 additional pages of documentation that has come from further research and tips that people in the community have provided, and information and files and church histories that they've shared with us to allow us to have a deeper understanding, biographical profiles, and also the oral histories. A number of people have contacted us about staff meeting with them to record the story of one of their elder members of their family. People have written brief little memoirs talking about a parent or grandparent to kind of enrich our file about the history of the Black community here. And the oral history part of it, that in-gathering effort will go on indefinitely. The grant-funded part of it, which is preparing the written report, that will have to wrap up in June per our agreement with the grantor.
And what happens to the document? It gets presented to City Council?
Yes.
And they do what with it?
We present it to our Preservation Commission, and we've done so previously. We actually showed the first draft when it came out with them to invite their comment on it. It'll go to council so that they're aware of it, so they can promote it, so they can be aware of the the rich history of the community, and they can do proper policy development that reflects an awareness of that history. That's
So
the
there's
hope.
necessarily no formal adoption that says this is to give this the city council stamp of approval that this is a guiding document.
Nothing at that level. We are obligated just for good best practice, and I think our grant requires us to show it to them, to have them look at it and review it. But yes, no binding agreement comes out of it where they're kind of bound to do a certain thing or the other based on the material presented in the report. And it's basically a history is what it is. And it will, an appendix to it will list properties that we think are really important that need to be protected in some way or recognized. But yeah, they're not obligated. Staff will pursue things going forward in the future. We'll bring forward landmark nominations. Currently, one of our really important partners, along with the Sacramento Observer and some of our churches like Shiloh Baptist and Sojourner Truth Museum, is California State University at Sacramento. They have contributed, the students there have contributed 3 components of our project, including research that they did, the collecting of oral histories of some of our community elders, and the current thing that they're working on is preparing detailed field surveys of at least 10 properties that have really strong African American historical significance connected with them. And that will go, that'll become part of this report, and it will guide city staff in bringing forward landmark nominations, in developing walking tours with the community, in doing public art projects that will, in particular, where significant events occurred, but there's no building. It'll be a way for the community to be aware that something really important and powerful happened in a particular place.
Well, Mr. Anderson, as it invariably happens here, we have more questions than we have time to deal with them. But I want to extract a promise from you that you'll come back into this space and we can finish our dialogue, because I would like to wade in the deep water of Oak Park specifically, and the things that are going on here. I think I know you have a perspective that very few have in terms of the history of the community and where we're at now. And looking even going forward, what future could there be? Not, it's I feel like the story of the Christmas Carol, when he was, Ebenezer was finally confronted with the ghost of Christmas yet to come. Are these the things? Are these the visions of things that must be, or are they the things that could be? We'll see. Mr. Carson Anderson, thank you so very, very, very much for entering into this space, and I look forward to the next round of conversation.
As do I. Thank you for the invitation. A really fun dialogue.